Good afternoon, everyone. This is another Daily Maverick special. We are thrilled to have with us today Bulelwa Mabasa. This is her book, a memoir called My Land Obsession. It is a wonderful read. It's from Pan Macmillan. It's available in stores right now, including the Daily Maverick store. It is a fabulous read, so I do urge you to get it. Bulelwa is a mother of four, most importantly. She lives in Johannesburg. She is the director and head of the Land Reform and Restitution and Tenure practice at Werksmans Attorneys. She has incredible experience in land reform and was appointed by President Cyril Ramaphosa as the only attorney on the Presidential Expert Advisory Panel on Land Reform and Agriculture in 2018, which was a foundational panel in South Africans having the opportunity to discuss this enormously emotive issue of land and land reform. Perhaps the most pressing issue in a lot of ways that we face here in South Africa, particularly as it pertains to equality of opportunity, of land access, and also of a sense of being, of a sense of nationhood, of a sense of becoming. So I think land is an extraordinarily emotive issue for South Africans. I think we all agree on that. And it's an absolute pleasure to have Bulelwa with us today. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Richard. It's lovely to be here.
So how's it been going? How does it feel releasing a book for the? I mean, this is your first book. It must be kind of different for you.
It's very different. So it's not my first book necessarily. I co-edited and co-authored an academic textbook, Land in South Africa, with MISTRA, the Mapungubwe Institute. But this memoir is a first of its kind in a sense that it is the first time where I speak about land on a very personal level, where I track the roots and the genesis in my life, in my formative years that have led me to want or to see this land question as something that really has always inhabited my being all my life, and that has resulted in my choice of career as an attorney, and also then, lending my voice in the national dialogue. How it feels surreal. I think there's a lot of vulnerability. I think when I was writing this book, I didn't fathom, I should have, but I didn't fathom that it would be in the hands of many other people, known and unknown. So there's a level of anxiety around, what people think. But I think it also, the process of writing it has been very cathartic for me, because I've delved into all the four corners of issues and things and anecdotes that I hadn't, thought about or reflected upon. So all in all, it's been exhilarating with a little bit of anxiety, but also excitement.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is very different from academic writing. It is a startlingly personal memoir of a young girl in Soweto coming of age and becoming a lawyer who ends up being able to define or help define or inform these critical questions. So why don't we sort of start at the beginning? Tell us a little bit about your upbringing, where you're from. And a little bit about your family. We were talking before we got on this webinar about what I found refreshing about this book. Once again, it's My Land Obsession, a memoir. What I found refreshing about it is that it isn't a miserablest memoir about an unhappy family. Tolstoy said all happy families are happy in the same way, and all unhappy families are happy in different ways. That's a really bad paraphrase on my behalf there. But I found this happy family, reading about them, learning about them, an enormously refreshing experience. So why don't you delve in and tell us a little bit about your earliest years?
So I was born in Middleland, Soweto, and in 1979. And in my formative years, which is probably most people's stories prior to the 90s, where I lived in what is regarded as a family home with grandparents, with aunts and uncles, with my parents in a kind of five-bedroom home with only 2 bedrooms. And if I had to define those formative years, they were full of joy. They were full of joy and affirmation and observing my grandfather, who was an ardent gardener. I observed how he had a very tangible relationship with the land in terms of, we all our vegetables came from the yard. And also watching my grandmother, who was, it was a typical Christian Methodist family, but at the same time, they practiced African spirituality. And so most of my ailments were treated in terms of the herbs that were grown from the ground. And, when, as would have it in Xhosa culture, when my umbilical cord stump falls, it gets buried into the ground in Meadowlands. And so it was not a conscious thing that I noticed about how so tangibly attached I was to the land until I think I was about 5 or 6 years old when I asked my father about a specific painting that was in our home in Meadowlands, Zone 4. And it was kind of very popular in the 80s. It's a painting of a young black girl with a teardrop and tattered clothes. And the artist, I don't know, it's signed as Verna, but this painting was so common in most households in Soweto. There we go. That's the one.
I want to see if we can kind of get an image of it there.
That's the one.
It's very recognizable for a lot of South Africans, yeah.
Yeah, so when I asked my father when I was 5, I said, why something drew me to this painting. And my father said to me, she is sad because she is landless. Her land was taken away from her. And that kind of statement, I think, really inhabited my mind and curiosity. That when I thought about careers, I only felt that law was the only career that I ever would be interested in. And that was on the basis that I felt maybe there is something in the law where I can lend a voice and I can find out more about this. And then when I started accessing what was called Model C schools, because initially I was in Guapalo Primary School in Meadowlands, the first time that I had access to urban white South Africa in Parktown, we were doing, it was a netball match, between this poor school in Meadowlands and this well-resourced school with pristine netball court. That's the first time that I encountered the disparity between my setting in Meadowlands Zone 4, very dense family home where more than 10 people lived, and the world of suburbia. And that also then
it's a wonderful scene. It's a wonderful scene in the book where your mother makes you you had a brand new pair of white tackies, brand new set of white white sports uniform. It's an amazing scene.
Yes, but then when I saw our opponents, they were in blue and white, pristine. Their uniform had the center, gold defense, and so I realized for the first time, I think I was 10 years old, that the warmth and the joy that I was so accustomed to and affirmed in Meadowlands Zone 4 was wanting. And so later on, when my father then could afford to take us to Model C schools, and when the political setting in the country changed in 1994, that was the first time then that I went to a school in the suburbs in Highlands North. And again, it was that realization of the pure kind of inequality, with me having to take 2 taxis and a bus to go to school, having to wake up at 4:30 in the morning and then come back after sunset, and then having to only do homework from 10 o'clock at night because I was doing chores. I was the firstborn child in the household. So that sense of place and that sense of differences in land, I was exposed to yards that had swimming pools and big tennis courts kind of also then continued as a mental note and a metaphor and build my curiosity around all of this. But while all of this was happening, my father was very deliberate about my reading. And so he kind of, he fed my curiosity. I was reading Chinua Achebe, Ngugi wa Thiong'o. I was reading Mongani Surute. And in all those literature and texts, I was realizing how colonization had land as its central tool for dispossession. Yeah. And so eventually, when I started at WITS in my first year, 1997, that coincided with the birth of our Constitution. Our Constitution came to life in February 1997, just as I was starting out as a first-year university student. And I was so excited, and I thought, you know, I'm going to learn about the Steve Biko trial. I'm going to learn about the Native Lands Act. But also remember, in my childhood, my grandparents told me stories around how they were removed from Sophia Town, you know, in a very real and practical way. And my grandfather told me stories about the searches as a mine worker, how they were searched in case they stole gold and so forth. So I was already kind of, I don't know if it was conscious or not conscious, but I was already thinking very, very deeply around these issues of land and inequality. Then I got to WITS and I studied law. And I was struck by how little of it is framed or based on South African history. Yes, I mean, I enjoyed law, I loved the law, but it just felt like the land question was not central to what I was studying as a lawyer.
And I think one point I think it's important to make is that your grandparents at least, were relocated from Sophia Town to Meadowlands, correct?
Correct.
So in other words, that dispossession was very much front and central in how they had to remake their life. So I guess that was probably also part of your formative years.
Yes, because
sorry, and just before we move on, I do want to hop back to that netball scene, because I think it has some applications, and I'm sure this was very conscious when you were writing it. For the fact that colonialism had land at its core, it also had rules at its core. And I think this is an amazing little paragraph that you write. I realized then that there was a code to the netball game that we were ignorant about. Every time we had the ball, which was rare in this game, the umpire would abruptly blow her whistle. Foot, fault, time, obstruction. Our game was fast, aggressive, and electric, with room for flair and creativity. Theirs was measured, steady, methodical, and clinical. My team members and I were not familiar with any of this, nor could I respond adequately to the exasperation and defeat our team was experiencing. We were annihilated. The champions of Meadowlands had fallen flat in their faces. Our opponents were graceful, stretching out their arms to shake our hands at the end of the game. That's an amazing metaphor for different interpretations of law and different applications of law for different population groups. And I can only imagine that must have been very, very influential in your early life, and certainly something you took to learning about the law at WITS, where there was this absence, I suppose, of anything perhaps real to your experience, especially that early on in the country's liberation.
Absolutely. You know, I think you're right in that netball match and the way that I phrased it is so poignant, because it speaks to being somebody who is probably in the minority in certain spaces, although being a Black person, obviously you're in the majority in the country. But as you enter formal spaces of learning, whether that is in a school that was majority a white school, or whether that is an academic institution, you almost felt that you had to remold your true being in order to fit within a framework that was not necessarily inherent, or that was not necessarily that didn't come easy for me. So that was in my mind, to my mind, was an experience that I would continue to relive, whether that was in high school or at university or even in a place of work. And so it then became very incumbent upon me. For example, when I started my legal profession at Werksmans to say, well, if the Group Areas Act or the Natives Land Act was not front and center to the study of law at university, it becomes incumbent upon me as a commercial attorney and litigator in Sandton to find ways in which I could develop a practice where this land reform issue could then become that front and center that I so much yearn for. So you're absolutely right that the formal academia, formal corporates are still built on kind of those colonial values. And I think if we just opened ourselves up more to learnings that I still use today from, African spirituality or even indigenous knowledge systems, if we can bring those into our reality and into the forefront, we would be so much better, because I think there has not been conscious effort in our society to probe and reflect on some of these colonial concepts and colonial values that seem to still be so dominant in our narrative.
I want to speak a little bit about how you established speaking about land at Werksmans, and how that, I suppose, that sort of unit was set up. But I just want to remind all of our viewers, of which there really are a number today. You have a top attorney at your beck and call right now. She will answer your questions for free. So please go ahead and ask whatever you have now. That you have another few minutes, because this is a very good opportunity to sort of pick Bulelwa's brain, which is exactly what I want to do about how you set up this this sort of land reform, restitution and tenure practice within Werksmans. What were the conversations like? How did you actually build this in the absence of any real precedent, or was there precedent?
So I always was intrigued by, what is our land reform policy? So I was already reading our national policy on land, which the ANC introduced in 1997. I was kind of reading at, looking at the legislation, but something extraordinary actually happened. That was the thing that made me decide to focus on this. For the first time, I think it was in 2007, I met the Nkosi family, who was a family based in Mpumalanga, and they had lodged a land claim in 1998. Their land claim was ignored, and it was awarded to another rival family. So they came to me to say, how do you help us legally to have our claim recognized? And so it was kind of a baptism in land reform, and it was almost like it was almost as if that file had, and I say this in the book, it almost like had magnetic powers. It just drew me so deeply. And from, having succeeded then to make sure that the Nkosi family's claim was gazetted, making sure that there was a settlement of the claim with all other parties, I then approached our chairman, who's David Hertz, in the firm, and I said, David, I think that it would be a travesty if we as a firm, as Werksmans, do not have a dedicated team with resources to focus on land reform. That discussion didn't even take more than 5 minutes. David Hertz immediately said, I support you. This is fascinating. It's something that, in fact, we were both struck by how that was never the focus, even with our major competitors. And it's not to say that I was the first person. I mean, there were people in other disciplines. There were, Ruth Hall, who's a big voice in the, social anthropology, and there's been historians that have been, but I think that never was it a focus on a corporate commercial firm in the scale that we did it. And so I was met with a lot of grace, actually, and I was given the free rein to give life and to breathe life into this practice, which today, I'm proud to say, it is also non-partisan, and it's also, I think, this practice acts for landowners, farmers, community members, people who are being evicted from land, mine workers. So I have a view of our entire society and aspects of land reform that are so different and so diverse that I think that's what led to then my appointment in the presidential advisory panel as the only lawyer, which was a multidisciplinary approach, with historians, economists, and so forth. So I was fortunate enough, and I think blessed actually, to never have been met with any acrimony or even reticence around building this practice, which I think I've grown to be very proud of.
Well, that's actually that's wonderful to hear. I'm wondering, given all of the noise around Section 25 in our Constitution, not many people really seem to know what they're talking about when they talk about it. So, what tools are you using in your practice to actually say, well, this is precedent, this is policy, this is? I mean, how do you interpret the law? And I'm imagining that you take Section 25 as the first sort of tool in your toolbox. Can you explain it to us idiots? How does it function? What does it actually say? Because there's just so much noise around it, and that noise has led to an enormously emotional response to land reform in this country.
I think first of all, to explain Section 25 would need us to understand how it came about. So with the Kempton Park negotiations that were happening when the Constitution was being discussed between the National Party and the ANC, Ruth Meyer was at the forefront for the National Party. Cyril Ramaphosa, incidentally, was at the forefront for the ANC when they were negotiating how land and property were going to be dealt with. You must accept that obviously the National Party had different anxieties. They wanted to ensure that property owners of the time would not lose land without recourse to the law. And on the other hand, the ANC wanted to ensure that there would be policies that would enable land reform or open up land for purposes of land reform. So that was the tension. And you see it in the wording. Because Section 25 forms part of a Bill of Rights, most rights in the Bill of Rights are stated in the positive. The right to life, you have a right to dignity, you have the right to access to housing. Section 25, very interestingly, it's stated in the negative. So it starts off by saying no one may be deprived of property unless by a law of general application. So already that tells you the tension and the difference in what was the issue. So that's the first thing. It tells us that no one may be deprived of property. No one may be deprived of property in an arbitrary manner, and there's got to be a law of general application when deprivation happens. And then it then talks about that no land may be expropriated unless in terms of Section 25(3). And then it tells us, it basically says that expropriation must happen with compensation firstly. So it does allow expropriation. But it then gives us a formula, 5 factors that must be taken into account to determine whether something could be, or a land or property could be expropriated. It says you must ensure that there is, you must look at whether or not there was direct state investment when somebody had, acquired that land. It says that the purpose of the expropriation is important. It tells us that the value of the land cannot be higher than the I would say the debt, and so forth. So and then later on, it then has this progressive, pragmatic section, which says that the state must take legislative steps and measures to ensure that there's land reform. Now, land reform has 3 pillars. It says that if you were dispossessed of land after 19 June 1913, you can have a land claim, and that is the restitution part of it, where there had been a dispossession. It was because of apartheid. You lodge a land claim. you either get your land back or compensation or even a combination. The second aspect of land reform talks about security of tenure. So that is a section that protects vulnerable people like farm dwellers and lawful occupiers or unlawful occupiers from arbitrary evictions. So now it suddenly says the people can only be evicted by way of a court order. Then the last element of land reform is redistribution, which says that the state must introduce legislation that tells people who need land, so not people that can prove dispossession, but people who need land, how the land must be obtained and who can benefit. So that is really the entire scheme. You can tell that it's got tensions in terms of the first section is there to protect current property owners, and it says the only way that land can be taken away is through a law of general application. Now, that law of general application has been what is called the Expropriation Act. And that act has been in existence since 1975. And expropriation as a concept is not unique to South Africa. It's a worldwide tool that governments use when they need land for a public purpose, like hospitals and schools.
That is a very important point to emphasize. And I think that gets a lot, because we tend to be a rather parochial people. Expropriation is not unique to South Africa by any means.
By any means. And in fact, when I did my research as part of the Presidential Advisory Panel, and I had access to Elmine du Plessis, who did her whole PhD around that, there is a whole plethora of international jurisprudence where expropriation is used every day by governments. In fact, if you think about the Gautrain, there were people that were living along the line of the Gautrain who had to be expropriated because it was for a public benefit, it was for a public transport means. And that's where, for me, where the weirdness comes in, is that it has been positioned as if this is an anomaly that seeks to eradicate property rights, and it is anything but that. But I think
it's communistic or socialist.
Absolutely. I mean, countries like the Netherlands have been at the forefront. Germany, this is what governments use as a tool to make room for public purposes. But specifically within the South African Constitution, it also says that expropriation may be used for land reform purposes explicitly, which most other constitutions don't have. So we have this unique thing that our constitution also envisages that it can also be used to progress these land reform objectives.
So let me ask you, as the granddaughter of grandparents who were effectively dispossessed of land in Sophiatown, to say nothing of the rural areas, is there a possibility for justice within Section 25 as it stands right now? Is there the possibility of some kind of healing with regard to the land question within the Constitution as it stands right now?
Absolutely. My view is that it's the land reform issues that stand to unite our country, stand to make everyone feel like they are a citizen, everyone feel like they belong. And in fact, when we were part of the land reform process in the Presidential Advisory Panel, we realized that the state has not used its powers to expropriate. Obviously not as a whole-scale program, but where it can, where the circumstances and the effects of each case allows for it. So we don't even have court precedents where this expropriation debate has been tested. I recall former Deputy Justice President Kgang Moseneke begging government to say, make this provision a living provision, bring along cases so that we can assist with this interpretation. And I, in my practice, was very close to actually having this matter, interpreted by the courts, where it was somewhere along the airport area, and there was an attempt to expropriate vast amounts of land. But unfortunately, that was not the case for it, because that land was developed. There were schools, there were already an established township and a household. So the unfortunate part of it is that the state has not used their ability within the current constitutional framework to test it. That's number one. Number two, the Expropriation Act of 1975 has still not been amended to suit what is in the Constitution. And that is how many years later? So the truth of the matter is that Parliament has not done.
And that's an apartheid act.
That's an apartheid
we're
act.
Literally. Yeah.
And that is the act.
It seems like there's enough time to change that.
Yes, we have had enough time to change it. And in fact, that 1975 Expropriation Act is still used today for public purposes. But we also understand that it has become archaic because it doesn't have the promotion of administrative justice principles that need you to, for example, for your side of the story to be heard, to negotiate pricing and all of that. So the state has been very lax about even introducing legislation that says, if I need land, if I don't have grandparents that were dispossessed, but I'm in need of land, where is the legislation that tells people who must benefit? How can land be made available? So far, what the government has done is they've relied on internal policies of the Department of Land and Land Reform, which in my view are not transparent enough. And they don't have the grounding of legislation which goes through all the checks and balances. So really, in my view, we have been let down by Parliament and the executive in setting a path forward and a national vision on land policy going forward. That is something that everyone and every citizen should really be behind and understand. And you don't have to look further than seeing the budget allocation to the Department of Land Reform is probably the least of all other budgets. Yet we say that the land question is the most critical issue.
And that certainly isn't reflected in government behavior. I mean, I would go one step further and say that over the course of 5 presidencies, land reform, land issues, various incarnations of the Ministry of Human Settlements have been brutal in their prosecution of effectively colonial-style land policies. I'm thinking of the times as a journalist I've watched the Red Ants work in and around Gauteng, using batons, the backs of guns, colluding with police in order to get people off the land, informal, illegally occupied, however you want to call it. Many journalists over the course of the last 27 years have seen extraordinary brutality in how the government has dealt with these policies. That in itself doesn't exactly lend to healing, does it?
Not at all. And I think that's what I try to do in my land obsession. As much as I felt the immediate consequences of dispossession through the fact that I was born in a township that was the first fruit of the Group Areas Act, or not being able to have access to transportation and the spatial disparities between where I lived vis-a-vis where I went to school. So that initial sin of dispossession has to appeal to all of us to kind of stop and reflect, so that we can understand how it continues until there is a special focused intent to heal those divisions of the past. And I think government has a big role to play in, for example, how they allow communities to have access to legal representation, for example. That's a big thing. Most of these, we've actually seen more evictions post 1994 that happen. That I think there's triple the number of evictions that have happened post 1994 compared to in the past, which is a travesty. And that is only borne by the fact that the people that have access to legal representation are the people that are, the haves and not the have-nots. And so you end up with these, as you see, inhumane, evictions that have dogged the post-democratic, the post-constitutional era, and government on its own, even in implementing these policies, have not done enough to capacitate people that can actually assist communities to curb these evictions. And as I say, because obviously as a lawyer, I see it, the lack of support when people are given land, even in those circumstances where there isn't a legislative framework that allows people then to have resources. How then do you make sure that the land is sustainable? How do you make sure that the land, continues to be productive? So it's all of those issues where I think that have really let down the discussion.
Yeah. Since my plea for questions, we're having a lot of really, really smart questions come in. So I think I'll ask another one, and then we'll sort of open it up to the floor, as it were, the virtual floor. But I'm wondering, Section 25 became a political football in 2017 after the ANC policy conference that kind of waffled around the fact that, yes, probably we are going to implement something around expropriation without compensation, and probably maybe crack open the Constitution and try to change things. This was due to a factional war within the ANC between the Radical Economic Transformation crew and the Team Cyril Ramaphosa crew. So after that, we have this presidential expert advisory panel on land reform and agriculture, which gets set up in 2018. Tell us a little bit about how you're brought on board to that. Tell us a little bit about how the mechanisms worked and how you interacted with, I guess, was an open floor to the people of South Africa as well, to come and input their thoughts, ideas, emotions around the land issue, back when anyone cared about it. And it doesn't seem like we've discussed it much since then. It seems to have fallen off the political radar. But 2017, 2018, 2019, those were big years where one felt that there was some political muscle, some conviction, some political will around addressing these issues. Tell us about how this process functioned. Tell us about how you feel about it now, whether there's been any movement, whether we're any further ahead. So
I think that the first thing that I'd like to comment on is that there were years in our political trajectory where the ANC easily had a 2/3 majority, where if it felt rightly or wrongly that the Constitution was not good enough as a tool, where they could have amended it then. But we find this. I remember experiencing this turnaround in December of 2017. And then again in February 2018, when the EFF, in fact, was the party that proposed a potential amendment to the Constitution. And at the time, obviously, the ANC had lost its 2/3 majority. And so it was very evident to me then that I was not particularly hopeful that that process of amending the Constitution would actually be delivered, because fundamentally, there are very two different philosophical and political positions on expropriation without compensation between the ANC and the EFF. On one hand, the ANC's position is that expropriation without compensation should form part of our tools to acquire land for land reform in the first place, right? But that it's not going to be the wholesale. So the ANC was not making arguments around eradication of property rights. So it was a moderate position. On the other hand, the EFF position was markedly different. What the EFF was saying is kill property rights, nationalize land, and let everybody else license land from the state. So from the get-go, for me, it was a damn squib. It was never going to lead to any kind of agreements on the issue of amending of the Constitution. So how I got into the panel, it's a little bit of a funny story in the book. I was invited as part of the ANC policy, where they were now looking at this land reform on a very a focused approach. And I was there, I gave input. And towards the end of the conference, I bumped into the president and I said to him, this issue of land reform requires a focused approach. Here are my details. I want to serve and I want to contribute to it. And 3 months later, then that led to the appointment of this panel, which was a 10-member panel with really, people that have also worked a lot in land, historians, economists, and so forth. And how that process worked, it allowed me, at least, let me speak for myself, to kind of put away my firmly held positions, but rather to use it as a learning. And as the process was undergoing, whether we were meeting with the deed registry or the different government departments or the ministers or the women in rural KZN or the NGOs, it became very clear to me then that there was a missing voice in the discussion. And I was being approached by some of my clients, some of the landowners, some of the farm workers who said to me, I want to donate land. I want to donate, I have excess land. There are people that have lived on my land for generations. And there is nothing in the law that makes provision for that. So far, the law is not punitive, but the expropriation is kind of almost forced. But what about the goodwill that exists? And so I was able to bring my voice into the panel. And that was then led to the introduction of what we suggested as a land donations policy, to say, where is the role of citizens in all of this? Where is the role of, outside of the Constitution? It's not as if I felt that the Constitution was not the only place in which land reform could actually happen, that there's a lot of goodwill that exists. Yeah. And so, yes, we do have a draft land policy, donations policy, but I'm not sure how alive it is. I'm not sure how it's being utilized. I'm not sure how, whether there are examples where we can actually show that this can happen. And then whilst I was in the panel, I also was dealing with other cases where, it was the Mdluli family in Mpumalanga that was awarded land, and it needed to have a partner to ensure the sustainability of land. And that led to a strategic partnership with, someone like Malcolm Siegel. And he was able to ensure that there is a strategic partnership in place on the sustainability of land, that where the Mdluli family itself are shareholders and they're equity owners, and it can be sustainable, and it can, they are, there's a life-size statue of Chief Mdluli. So I found that there is such goodwill, and I found that that goodwill is not prominent in the ways that we talk about land, in the ways that we can seek out potential solutions. And so I found in the panel that I was able to use my cases that I was dealing with in the practice and feed that into the panel on recommendations that I felt would kind of move the debates. Even things like allowing government to release existing buildings and make it, make those buildings available for landless people. The big idea that I also brought to that land reform panel was the urban question, because I found that the framing of the land question was around farming, agriculture. There was this underlying, I think, view that the land question is about rurality. And when I looked around and I looked at the stats on urban densification, where people want to be close to economic nodes and opportunities, I found that the debate was lacking in that respect. And so one of the recommendations made was to say the National Development Plan and the Department of COGTA, that is the department that deals with the urban issues, have to speak together. And actually the land reform solutions that we have must speak to the urban issues as well. you know,
Right.
and I found, you know, very, very real tensions. For example, that in the area of the urban land, there is what is called the best value, where you know, there is economic capital around density. The land is less land and so forth. But in my view, I was saying, how can we then promote mixed use type of you know, buildings, so that we can bridge the gap of the spatial inequality? I actually got introduced to a very interesting concept that's called nimbism, NIMBY. And what it means is not in my backyard. So I also found that even within the urban sector, whether you're black or white, there is this phobia around having poor people live with you, or around poorer people living in your same area. And those are some of the real discussions that we ought to be having. You know, people were saying, how about I close my swimming pool? If I have a tennis court size yard, I close my swimming pool and build around it, so that if I have a helper, or if I have children of the helper, I could make space so that we can all enjoy the benefits of urban spaces. So these are the kind of conversations that are not actually happening. We're not thinking about, well, what can we do to ensure that the spatial disparity is closed? Because 60%, let's face it, 60% of salaries of South Africans are spent on transport, because we still have spatial inequalities that was introduced with the Group Areas Act. We still live with it. Yeah.
And NIMBYism is a huge inhibiting factor in the progressive nature of city planning. I mean, if your entire wealth as a middle class or lower middle class person is invested in your property, then you're seriously incentivized to ensure that that property value keeps on going up and going up and going up. The proximity of poor people, I mean, let's face it, is likely to bring those property values down. Right there's an immense injustice in the possibilities for our cities being able to grow any further. I want to throw to a question from Ivan Turek, which I think you answered, but if there's anything else you want to touch on there, you go right ahead. Ivan says, does the speaker agree that urban land reform is often neglected in the land debate, which obviously you do? If so, what is distinctive about urban land reform compared with rural land? Are there any specifics that you need to switch around in your arsenal of weapons that you use in order to address urban land reform?
So interestingly, rural land is typically the TBVC state land that was as a result of the apartheid legislation. And those the issues of rural land reform, those are the old Bantustans, and they have very particular areas of areas. And I don't know if this was by fate or by luck or whatever, but what we're seeing is that most, for example, mineral deposits find themselves in those former TBVC states. And so the problems in rural areas have to do with how mining companies coexist with their communities, how they contribute and benefit the communities around them. But also, they've got particular issues around tenure. You will recall that through the Bantustan legislation, people in those rural areas only had communal land as a land holding. So people don't have the certainty, the certainty on land rights. They don't have, or individual or even family land holdings. We also have a third tension with the rural areas around chieftaincies and traditional leaderships. So the rural land debate has very particular issues that are very unique to them, and that the communal tenure issue is central to it, because, and I think this is something that was also dealt with in the academic book that I spoke about, Land in South Africa, where even today, the communal land tenure system that makes rural people beholden to the state. So they can't own land. The state owns land on their behalf, or they have to go via a traditional leader. That system has still not been dismantled. It has still not been dismantled. So you still have a dual system in South Africa where people that live in rural areas don't have the legal instruments or the legal certainty to do as they wish with the land in which they own. And post-constitution, that system has been perpetuated, because even when those communities gained land, they have to own land in groups, as communal property associations or in trust, and it's unwieldy. It's just, there's so much litigation, it just doesn't work. So that's a very specific rural issue. When it comes to urban land, you will recall that when I spoke about restitution, I said that you needed to show dispossession after 1913. And then what had happened in the urban setting is that because it was built up, we have some mine dumps, we have companies, we have corporates, it's very then difficult to restore land as is. So what has happened with the urban issue was that people were then given financial compensation, for example. But with the urban issue, the solutions that must come with the urban issues is how then, as I said, how then do we bridge those spatial inequalities, and how do we share the space in the urban settings? And also, even with the urban settings, people in informal settlements or backyards, which are the majority of the people, also still don't have tenure. And when I say tenure, I say few people have title deeds. In fact, a majority of those people, over 80%, you're not going to find them in the deeds registry, which is a portal that tells you who owns what land in South Africa. It's still a very big white elephant. And, intellectually, there is debates around whether people need to own land, do people need title deeds, or do people have to have access to land? And we still don't have a policy that is clear, or direction that says, what is the future of South African land tenure? Is it all of us having access to land in whatever way, or is the idea that we are all going to become title holders? And that's another big gap in the vision of tenure issues in South Africa.
Well, it's only been 28 years, Bulelwa. I'm sure someone will figure it out at some point. I hope that answers or goes some way to answering Karen Webner's question: is there harmony between Section 25 and customary land laws, including inheritance? Which I think you're saying not really. Not really.
And in fact, part of the chapter I wrote in the Presidential Advisory Panel, I identified legislation that I said undermines this idea of an equal unitary tenure land rights system, because you still have legislation that says if you are in a rural area, you have to go through a process to upgrade your rights, but then there's nothing that says what kind of rights are those. Are you going to get a title deed? We still have people being beholden to permissions to occupy P2Os, which are not recognized by the banks. They're not recognized in the formal economy, that they can't be used. In fact, you will recall that there was a judgment in the Pietermaritzburg court on the Ingonyama Trust Board issues around how the minister has to regularize and to democratize those legal, so-called legal instruments that just don't provide enough protection to the people living in those customary law settings.
Derek Pariachi asks a very interesting question, and I think it does get to the heart of the weaponization of this issue. Hi, everyone. What is the views regarding the EFF encouraging land grabs? We witness this happening frequently. Like many journalists working in and around these issues, I've seen how land grabs unfold. From the one end, one can understand that people absolutely need to increase the footprint of where they're living, especially in overcrowded locations. And on the other hand, these are viewed by the people who hold the land, very often the government, as illegal occupations. There's this huge tension between very real need, the law, and in the middle of that, people trying to weaponize this issue. So what are your thoughts on the encouragement of land grabs?
We see this in our practice. I mean, I can tell you about two cases that come to mind where people got onto land illegally within an office park in Midrand, and most of these people were kind of foreign nationals who were trying to make a living. They are waste pickers and waste recyclers. So you have that, the poverty, the people just trying to make a living on the one hand, and then you have a landowner who is also protected by the same Section 25 principle that says they can't be deprived of their own land for arbitrary purposes. What we are finding is that the courts are now being forced to be placed in a position to weigh up these very competing interests. And more the jurisprudence that's coming from courts is the reluctance to neglect poor people or allow poor people to remain landless. And by the way, the very same constitution says that it is the duty of the state to provide alternative accommodation in evictions. And what we're finding now is that we have the city of Johannesburg or the city of Cape Town or whatever, having this constitutional obligation to provide this alternative accommodation. It's in urban areas where there is limited land, there's not enough space, and the judiciary are caught up in the middle to find ways and means to assist poor people. But at the same time, there just isn't enough resources or land or even capacity for alternative accommodation to be made. So what we're finding in these cases that I'm talking about, that I'm dealing with now, we're finding that eviction applications can take years. And if you are the landowner, it could be me, it could be me, it could be you, it could be me. If you are in that position, you are now having to be placed with this obligation to pay legal fees and so forth in circumstances where you didn't kind of create that situation or create that thing. And what that goes to, it goes into a state that is potentially not capable, or a state that has failed to provide basic goods and services, a state that has not gotten right the immigration issues. And you're finding those things now having to be dealt with by courts who are not meant to be running the country. So this is a really interesting issue that us as attorneys and as lawyers are kind of having to grapple with, that are not known out there. And so yes, then I don't want to call them land grabs. I think that I don't like the terminology, but the issues of poverty, unemployment are actually being felt as the land question is where you see those things actually come to play.
Well, look, I mean, we've run out of time. I could do this for another 4 hours. It's just astonishing how much there is here. I think your book, My Land Obsession, published by Pan Macmillan, out now in stores everywhere, but available for your purchase right now on the Daily Maverick store, is a beautiful way, a personal way into these issues. It's a memoir about a family who end up being very successful and who end up influencing how this country starts to take shape after apartheid in many, many different ways. It's warm, it's full of love, it's full of joy, and it's a beautiful, beautiful read. And it's also full of real substantial work on the land issues, which comes down to a lifetime, I guess, Bulelwa, of thinking about these issues. So thank you so much for writing this book. I urge the many people on this call to go out and purchase it right now. We wish you luck going forward, and I really hope we get to speak again and to take up these issues even more so.
Thank you, Richard. I really appreciate your kind words, and I've enjoyed our discussion. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks to everybody who showed up, and once again, thank you to the Maverick Insiders. You guys are our backbone. You keep us going, and you also keep us in check, which of course we need every once in a while. So thank you, everybody. Have a great day forward, and we'll see you all soon.